Hello, welcome. Jason, what's up? Invite you up there. All right, well, we'll just wait here for a few minutes for more people to jump on in. Hello. Hey, what's up, dude? Ishan should be joining us here. Let's see. And just make sure he is aware. There he is, actually. All right. Speaking of, all right, let me invite co-host send. There you go. Nishan, I sent you the co-host invite there. I don't know. Here, I'll cancel it and redo it. Sometimes it like pops up on your thing and goes away real quick. Add a speaker. Okay, I'll just add you as a speaker. I don't know why the co-host thing isn't working. But there we go.
Here we go. There we go.
There we go. Cool.
Actually, you canceled it right as I was clicking on it. So then it gave me this really cryptic, like, error message null. Like somebody did not test that workflow in Twitter space.
Hey, we got the whole team here. All right.
Yeah, it's been a while. Yeah.
I saw the email. There's a JavaScript Jam newsletter.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
We had a newsletter go out. We can talk about that in a second, but do you want to kick us off, Scott?
Yeah, absolutely. All right, y'all. Welcome to JavaScript Jam Live. This is where we party all day and all night. No, this is every Wednesday, 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. We talk about JavaScript and anything really web development related. And in fact, actually, if you're a beginner at this or you've been doing this a long time, it doesn't matter. We love to hear from everybody. And in fact, actually, some of the greatest conversations that we've had up here are from in the audience and participating. So if you're out there in the audience and you want to participate, you want to ask a question, we encourage it. Not just asking a question, but also giving your opinion too. So feel free to request to come up as a speaker, and we'll be more than happy to have you up here and participating in the conversation. With that being said, we have our lovely co-host here, Ishan, who's going to be chit-chatting it up throughout the duration here for the most part with all you too as well. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, and I think I'm back from PTO. I think I missed the last 2 weeks, so it's great to be back. And as Anthony noted, we had the newsletter go out. So those of you who are listening that aren't on the newsletter, you can actually go to composability.dev and then sign up, give your email address. You'll eventually be able to go to JavaScriptJam as well.com and sign up for the newsletter. It'll be the same newsletter that we'll be sending out, talking about both composability, which is what the summit was about, as well as topics in the JavaScript and web development ecosystem in general. And so it's our little newsletter we'll be publishing out on what we think is interesting in the web. And one section of it is going to be about what we talked about last week in these weekly sessions, and then what looks interesting to talk about in the next session. So feel free to use the newsletter. There'll be a link in there where you can suggest a topic for us to talk about. We want this to be like our JavaScript Jam live sessions, which means they're driven as much by you guys as they're driven by us. So that's the newsletter. And there's a couple things I put in there for us to talk about that came up in the last week. But I'll first open it up to the panel here. Is there anything that's on folks' mind in the web dev JavaScript ecosystem that's top of mind besides what I put in the newsletter for this week? Or anything I missed from the last 2 weeks that you think is worth revisiting? Okay, I'm hearing not. Actually, wait, let me just do a sound check. Can you guys still hear me? Did I lose connection?
Yeah,
We're here.
Yeah. Okay,
Hit us with the topics.
okay.
Not to sidetrack too much, but I did find the newsletter in my spam box. I'm not sure why.
Oh no, that's
Same. Yeah,
Oh,
same. And
okay.
how did you get my email? Because I'm sure I've given you my email lots of times. I don't know if I signed up for a JavaScript Jam newsletter, though.
You probably signed up for composability.dev.
Excellent.
Composability.dev, as a speaker on composability.dev, you probably signed up for the conference to watch it. That's where we got your email.
Great. Yeah.
Actually, Anthony,
About
I
that.
just knew your email and I manually typed it in.
I would hope you'd have me go by now. The amount of times I'm giving it to you. Ever since.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Oh, actually, speaking of, so this is a sidetrack. Anthony is the host of a podcast, FS Jam, which I've been a big fan of his own, but you just launched the second podcast. Do you want to
It's a
talk
stream.
about?
It's not a podcast. I think there's a very important distinction here. There's something that confuses my partner to no end when I talk about whether I'm doing a podcast or a Twitter space or a stream or any of those three things. So to me, FSJam has never had a video component, not even just like showing our faces when we talk, like at all. Whereas I see a stream as something where there's video and then there's also usually screen sharing. So I've created a stream where I do, like, if you learn with Jason or
Yep.
Alex Trost front end horse
Yep.
or Ben Meyer semantics, there's a lot of streams like this, or even Teach Gen Tech. And there's streams where you have a host, they bring on a guest, the guest usually walks them through some sort of project that they build. So it's a bit like pair programming, which I really like. And typically the host drives, they're the ones coding, while the guest kind of will talk them through things or help them figure out the projects. The idea being that they're the expert and you're the noob, and you're giving them a chance to teach something, but you're saying them to teach something hopefully comprehensible and like boundly scoped. So yeah, I've been hosting streams for my companies in the past. I hosted StepZen stream for a while. I currently host QuickNotice stream, and I just love streams. And I wanted to finally have my own kind of trigger on that, because Ben Myers gave me a sweet name. He told me I should call it AJC and the Web Devs. And my philosophy on projects is once you have a good name, you have to start it. So that was why I started.
I have a friend in college where that was how we did business ideas and band names. Forget the music, just
Yep.
like as soon as we get a good name for the band, let's start. But you actually executed. You want to tell people the domain name, or if we just Google AJC and the web devs, that
So the place you would want to find it would be twitch.tv/AJC Web Dev. So it's still my same handle, AJC Web Dev, and you can find it on Twitch. Also uploading them after the fact to YouTube, but that's not really as important. As you want to watch them live as they're happening, you want to check out the Twitch, and you can also check out the videos on demand up to 2 weeks after they air. So if you go to twitch.tv/AJC Web Dev, you'll see the last 2 episodes. If you Google AJC and the Web Dev, I have gotten a good SEO for that, it seems, because of my second episode will pop up first on YouTube. But
I see
first
that.
episode was with Ben Myers, speaking of again, and he helped me build out a social share card for the show using HTML and CSS. It's a really fascinating concept where you build like a page that has a title and 2 little floating image heads and like your show name and the date, and you can fill in the HTML to create new social share cards for each episode. So that was episode 1. And then episode 2 was with Ryan Carniato, just talking about Solid, because he's a good friend and I'm already had him on the podcast and wanted to learn more about Solid and thought that would be a good hooky episode for people who are interested in new front end stuff. Solid's pretty hyped.
Do you want to give us a preview of what episode 3 is?
Episode 3 will be a solo stream that I'll be doing by myself, and I'm going to be running through Bun for the first time. So I'm obviously aware of Bun. We talked about Bun, I think, last week on here, and I'm going to be going through the docs and like their kind of hello world. I haven't used it yet. So it's going to be me kind of in fresh and seeing what happens and what I can build with it.
Oh, well, it's almost like a perfect seg for it was the 3rd item in the newsletter, which was Bun just launched Oven, announced, I think, like 7 million in new funding just recently. It's definitely looking like that would be the next topic to move to. There's both the fact that Bun launches Oven, but then there's this, it seems like we're in a new era where it's called the post-node era. Let me throw this as a proposition, see if it resonates with folks and if people can agree or disagree. But it's a post-node era. Just one prediction of this is not only will we have Bun and other Dino, but we could end up like JavaScript frameworks where it's just like a new runtime coming out all the time. It feels like we're seeing with JavaScript front-end frameworks. Maybe that's too much of an exaggeration.
It's funny you say that, because so the reason why I decided to do Bun is because someone actually messaged me about the show, was asking me what my next episode would be. I'm like, I'm going to do a solo stream. What should I do it on? And he's like, do it on Bun. Do you think it's really going to be able to take on Node? And my response to him was exactly what you said. I don't think we need to be in a world where something kills another thing to be a viable thing. I think we could be in a world where there's just multiple good options that have different trade-offs, and people can pick whichever they want. And there may be a front runner, like act as the front runner, but that doesn't mean felt a bad choice or saw it's a bad choice. It just means it's not the most popular choice. And I think that it would be awesome if the backend was the same way. There's just like various good choices people can choose from.
So it sounds like so do you believe that we're going to end up in a post Node world, but it will continue to be dominated by Node? This kind of prediction you're making.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been in a post node world. I've been using Dino for example apps and like talking about it and promoting it for at least 2 years now. So I think that, Dino has been a viable alternative to Node, depending on your reliance on NPM ecosystem
Yep.
asterisks. But beyond that, like there's nothing wrong with it. It works just fine. I think you've already kind of there. I think Bun is helping reinforce that and make it mainstream idea that there are alternatives to nodes. Yeah, I think it's great.
Node's not going anywhere. The install base is so massive and the tool chain and ecosystem is beyond description. So it's not going anywhere. But these upstarts will definitely have their own place in the world. So just like React has become so dominant, but like we were just saying, we're going to get we have a lot of new choices for very specific use cases, and Bun might not be super useful in a lot of different places today, but they're only a few weeks old or a year or two old.
Take it from the perspective of somebody who's coming at this from the first time. All they've known is Node is just kind of a fait accompli as the default. What would you express to them is the trigger that's been causing the post Node era? How would you describe it? Like, what are Bun and Dino solving? I have my own view on this, but how would you express it? I'm curious from the panel on what's the hole they're filling or the differentiation there.
Ryan was kind enough. I'd be curious to get Theo's thoughts. Theo's
Yeah.
been a Dino fan for a while, but Ryan laid out 8 reasons of why he thought we should move away from Node in the talk, which he did not name 10 things I regret about Node. This is a funny kind of side tangent. The top 10 things I regret about Node has 8 regrets in it because he did not name it that talk. The conference renamed it to that talk. Mostly like that. He felt that the dependencies were crazy. Node JIP sucked. There was like a lot of kind of ideas in the project structure and things that he just felt like they're being cleaner. And he wanted to go for more of a node-like ecosystem where you have a single binary, a standard library. And so there's like a whole host of reasons that he has elucidated at length. But I think that it just also security, like there's like Node's not very secure. Dino is potentially more secure. So I would say that's kind of the first set of reasons that particularly get cited.
Yeah, I think you're talking about, so just for folks, if you Google 10 things I regret about Node, Ryan Dahl, who created Node, as a talk, as well as I think an article where he outlines the things that he wishes he had done differently, what he's learned from doing it. I think there's security built in TypeScript, a bunch of other things. But is there anything that jumps out to you? Like for me, when I looked at Dino, what I thought was really interesting, and maybe that just shows my bias as somebody who's usually came from like a C+ background, like better, the way that they've structured it with a very, what's the right way to say it? Like in Node, if they want to call out to the operating system or an SAPI, they just kind of bind it directly to it. And they're a lot more rigorous about, hey, there's this one single binding point that everything goes through. And that way you can control the API surface area as an embedder into a system a lot better. The other thing that I think is really useful is just that their focus on, these are really built to run, not as long-lived servers, but what I view a lot of these guys doing is trying to look at startup time and for execution on the edge. Those are the 2 things that jump out at me, but I'm curious to hear what jumps out to other folks as well.
Yeah, I think Theo raised it.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I've been trying to go since they showed up. Goddamn.
Oh, yeah.
Hey,
super-
wait, Theo, before you start, I just want to make sure you're going to provide us with good captions for this.
I'll do my best. I will read every word I say and manually mail those via paper mail to anybody who needs.
Okay,
I'm
thank
upset
you.
about that. Anyways, I feel like we're doing the thing we love to do as engineers, where we talk a lot about features and implementation details and not about like why. The need for Deno is much less like any one stack or technical change. It's much more a vibe. There's a specific vibe that Ryan was trying to go for with Node, which is take the elegance of writing a quick, simple script in your browser to the CLI with the power of JavaScript and all of the dynamic behaviors the language has. And as Node has evolved, as package.json's become more essential, as the ecosystems become more and more complex, that elegance has been lost. It's no longer as simple as you write a JavaScript file and run it. And on top of that, TypeScript throws a huge wrench into things as well, where now you have to have a whole build chain just to make your TypeScript file into a JavaScript file that you can run. His goal was specifically bring back the simplicity of writing JavaScript in the console and the web to the CLI, and to make the simplest method for writing scripts in that mindset. And when he worked on that, he took things he learned from Golang, from TypeScript, from Rust, and from these other communities and the way they did things around security and all these other things we're talking about here. But that wasn't the goal. Those were nice things he learned from his mistakes with Node. The goal was very specifically bring back the simplicity and elegance of JavaScript on the web and treat the console more like a web browser.
I think that's very well put. There's an episode of Google guys, and I forgot the other, it's an S, the podcast, HTTP 203, I think they call it. They talk about how the great thing about Dino is it feels like it's got a lot of the web philosophy in it. But I really like how you described it, which is it's the simplicity of just writing a quick script from just in the command line like you would in the browser. To the extent that the APIs are the same that you'd use in the browser that you'd use inside a Dino environment. What do you think of Bun then? I'm curious, Theo.
I think Bun is doing the thing that we were all doing 5 minutes ago, where it's getting really nerdy about the specs. And it's incredibly nerdy about the specs. It's going to push a lot of stuff forward. It's actually like actively improved the app kit, like JavaScript layers and JS core, like significantly. I think that those innovations are great, but they are not a rethinking of workflows. They're a challenge to the speed of the current workflows. I don't think Bun's ultimate goal is to change how we do development. I think its goal is very explicitly to speed up how we're currently doing development, whereas Deno is trying to rethink the whole flow.
Interesting.
Bun is competing with Node, not Deno, and I see Deno as competing with like other. Like I see Deno as competing with Python more than JavaScript, if that makes sense, or more than Node, if that makes sense. Now they're changing that because that didn't work, but the initial plan for Deno was it'd be Python for TypeScript and JavaScript, basically.
Can you walk that connection, that the Python one forward? I'm not sure actually I fully processed that.
My understanding of like how people view Python is definitely not how they do anymore, but the way it was pitched to me back in the day, and I still think of it the way, is the easiest way to open up a file, write some code, and then run it on your machine. Node is nowhere near as elegant for a new developer writing their first code and running it, especially if they want to use the better version of JavaScript known as TypeScript. Those hurdles are not things that Bun is trying to cross. In fact, Bun almost inarguably makes it harder to do web development. Almost every post I've seen people comparing Bun stats, about half or more of them have numbers that look like shit. And every single one of them isn't actually using Bun to run the code, which is hilarious. That's not how I see them. I see the way Bun's doing things in that regard, almost inverse from how Deno is, where Deno's trying to make things easier. Bun doesn't care if they get harder as long as they get faster.
Interesting. So I cut out part of that, but I think if I was to fill in the blanks, basically what you're saying is the fastest way to get from writing a script to serving it on the web, Python was dead easy. And that's who Deno is competing with, in a sense.
Not even just serving on the web, but like running on your own machine, even. It's way easier with Deno and Python than it is with Node getting started there.
Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Interesting. Curious if there are any folks in the audience or panel who want to jump in or add their take on Deno versus Bun. Feel free to raise your hand. In the meantime, then, I guess to walk this back to the original question, is it a post-Node world where we're going to see a Cambrian-like explosion of server-side runtimes, just like we see an explosion in JavaScript frameworks in a post-React world, or you think it's just going to be, it'll settle down to it's, Bun and Node and maybe one or two others?
I think Jason had something to say.
Oh,
Yeah, not directly on that particular flavor of the question, but maybe I'll get there. Node was invented in a completely different era, right? The VMs were kind of guard then. Big, today's standards, they're big, heavy runtimes. Were most likely running on some dedicated server somewhere. And so Node was great for that because it was much lighter than the alternatives, except for maybe Ruby. So it had its own kind of, it was a product of its own ecosystem, right? It was a hack on top of JavaScript to make it easy to run on the server, which there were other options, but there's Rhino and Narwhal and some other Java-based VMs that you could run JavaScript on the server, but Node won out. And the new upstarts, Bun and are just for the product of today's systems where we're moving from VMs are considered too heavy. So now we're moving to edge compute. And once we get to edge compute, you need a completely different type of runtime environment. So these systems will be much more aligned with the way we're probably going to want to build, deploy applications over the next decade, right? So that's kind of my take on it. I think it'll be, and every time this happens, Node came out, there were 2 or 3 other different ways of doing JavaScript on the server. We've just forgotten about them now because Node became so dominant. So who knows who's going to win this round? Time will have to tell, but it's kind of entering in a new phase of a next era of JavaScript runtimes.
Anyone remember IO.js?
Yeah.
Yeah.
When Node came out, there were, build tool chains outside of Dojo, which I'm pretty familiar with, didn't exist. It didn't build JavaScript ever. And that was critical at the time. The world was completely different in 2008, 2009.
So I guess pragmatically for the everyday engineer, is it worth at this point now bothering to learn, or should they wait till they need it and just not worry about it?
If it solves a problem for you, use it. It solves some very specific problems for me. I do every winter during the holiday seasons. I do the Advent of Code programming challenge, and I like using TypeScript for those. I don't like setting up a crazy fucking TypeScript environment to do those. So I use every day for 1 month every year to do programming challenges. It is phenomenal for that. I can't imagine a better tool set for quickly getting a TypeScript file running in a stressful programming challenge environment. I have that use case and it works really well for it. If you have things like that, it's nice, but I don't think you should go out of your way to learn Dino so much as use Dino if it solves a specific problem you're having with your TypeScript environments.
Agreed.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. We're nearly at halfway point. So I'm going to do usual station break. Actually, I'll hand it over to Scott to do our station break and then I'll go on to the next topic.
Sure. All right. Hey, thanks everybody for joining us today. Greatly appreciate it. You've made it halfway through. Congratulations. Give yourself a pat on the back. There's been some great conversations. Thank you so much, everybody participating thus far, those up here right now speaking, and those who came up to a little chat. So if you're in the audience there, if you're getting value from people up here, click on them, follow them, because obviously if you're getting value from them here, you're probably going to get value from them other places as well. Now, we do this every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And love it. And everybody participates, by the way. If you're in the audience there and you have a question, it doesn't matter whether you're new or you've been doing this for a very long time. We love to hear from everybody. In fact, that's where we get typically the best conversations going on here is when people do come up from the audience and either ask a question or give their opinion on something. Just really brings the value to everybody here. And also, topic here is obviously JavaScript. We also just dive around everywhere in the web development area. So free to speak on those things as well. All right. I'll hand it back to Ishan. Thank y'all so much. And don't forget, I do want to sign up for our newsletter set at composability.dev there. If you've already gone to composability.dev and partaken in that and watched the summit that we had, you're basically already on the list for the newsletter because it's part of that whole process too. This is an ongoing, like we spoke of before. If you don't recall, I'll remind you, this is an ongoing evergreen thing. And we're going to continue producing more content, speakers, things like that, all kinds of cool stuff coming your way, including the newsletter. So super exciting stuff. Looking forward to pushing more value out to you guys.
Okay. Thanks, Scott. So the other thing I had in the newsletter this week, by the way, just to add on to that, you can always suggest a topic now by just raising your hand and we're happy to jump on that. Or in the newsletter, there's a link you can click where you can submit an idea for us to talk about. We prefer to do it that way. One of the things that was in there was an article, which some of you guys might have seen. It was on Hacker News. It was like, Devops is an idea so good, no one admits they don't do it. And basically the gist of the article was that it's become such a assumed good thing that folks are scared to actually say they aren't doing DevOps. And what it's led to is almost an example symptom of this is you've got people who aren't actually doing DevOps with their title changed to DevOps, and they're still doing IT operations. So his example was, quote, John used to be an IT operations guy, but now he's a DevOps engineer. And he called this, most egregious examples when a company simply changes the job titles of all of its ops people. And the reason I pulled this out is when we go and we talk to in the market and in our company, we do see elements of this in some companies and not in all companies. And so first thing I'm really curious about is, does this statement seem to to jive with folks that there's a loss of meaning of the term DevOps, where everyone says they do DevOps, but they're not actually doing it. I mean, statement in this article is, by now the term DevOps has lost all meaning. Now everyone just does, even when they're doing ops, they call it DevOps, basically. And again, the title is An Idea So Good, No One Admits They Don't Do It. You can probably Google it, or it's in the newsletter. So first, let me throw it out there and see if folks feel like that's accurate or if folks think that's inaccurate.
In the companies I work with, I'd 100% agree with that assessment.
Which is to say, 100% of them, you feel, say they're doing DevOps, but they're really not.
Outside of the early startup space, any company that's been around for a while has just relabeled their ops team.
Yeah, I'm reminded back in the early days of the cloud era, there was a cartoon where it basically shows a guy switching the sign on the door from data center to private cloud. And the guy asks him, "Are we done with our private cloud migration?" He's like, "Yup, we just changed the title on it." Okay, so
There was one counterexample of that of a company I won't name that was fairly old and actually had engineers on their team that were writing code and doing deployments and setting up development deployment infrastructure that most of us would consider true DevOps. But that was the outlier.
interesting. Well, actually, so then let's make this truly concrete for the audience. I can attempt my definition, but Jason, how would you define true DevOps?
I don't know. Let's see. I don't know if I have a canonical definition, but I'll give it a shot. So if you have an engineer, it's a self-contained engineering team that can take everything from code, planning and deployment and code to production. So startups almost always operate like this. They don't have dedicated people when they're early that just all they do is maintain the servers. That doesn't, that's the counterexample, right? So if you've got DevOps people, and maybe if somebody wants to jump in with a better example, you have people on your team that are developers that can write code, that also know how to not only understand, but configure, design, and deploy your infrastructure to deploy that code. So it's basically a self-contained team.
Theo, I see you with your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't got a better definition. Honestly, DevOps is just a term I've never really cared for. I think every developer has their direct customer. And if you're a developer and your customer is the developers at your company, then you're DevOps. Like that feels pretty straightforward to me. But generally speaking, the problems I see don't necessarily align with what I'm hearing here. While I totally trust that there's a lot of people in the industry who used to be IT people that are now given the title DevOps and don't really do anything different. That's not an experience I've personally had, at least at like Amazon and Twitch and also Microsoft. Those were not things I saw at all, really. Something I do see a lot of, though, and it's weird and painful, is smaller startups. Like we're talking less than 10 people, sometimes less than 5 engineers, starting to hire DevOps because their developer pipelines are so screwed that early because they built everything the FANG way or like the big company way at a 5-person startup. If you're not using GitHub and GitHub Actions, if you're not using things like Vercel and PlanetScale, if you're not using these tools that make it very simple to build a good developer experience at early stage, you're fucking up, period. You're throwing away one of your best competitive advantages. For companies who do developer optimization way better than anyone you can hire until you're big enough to hire a team. And it's very easy to fall in the trap of needing DevOps because your developers didn't optimize well enough in the first place.
Interesting. So I see this actually in both large and small companies. There are large companies who will hire DevOps to build a platform that's like a Vercel, Edgio, Netlify, and they're trying to build it the same thing. And they're not going to build it with the same level of experience, DX, as platform dedicated to that. And I see that actually even at large companies. There are enterprises that do it because they think we need to do it ourselves. Some actually ran into this in the early days in cloud, where we used to have stuff on AWS, and customers who are in e-commerce were like, well, you run on AWS, so we can't, we're in e-commerce, so we compete with them. So we can't do anything that's on their technology. But I see plenty of large companies that have that philosophy as well, that we need to build it ourselves. And I guess what I'm suggesting is that large and small companies, it almost doesn't make sense. unless you're really at a large scale, even beyond 10 people.
Yeah, there are definitely use cases where I would say, like, at Twitch, for example, if we had bought in on Vercel for like our internal tools, we could have moved a lot faster. But instead, we had to have multiple infra people, and the DevOps person focused on the internal safety tools team for a while. Whenever things broke, we had to pull them back in. And now they're having a crazy problem with this team because nobody wants to work on the Kubernetes cluster. There shouldn't be Kubernetes. It should all be Lambda function. And as a result, 2 of the 3 engineers who know Kubernetes have left the company. And there's this 120-year-old kid holding together all of internal safety at Twitch because they made a developer ops problem by introducing a need for developer ops too early. Very common problem. Not invented here syndrome is the fucking worst. And it's one of the best advantages we have as startups is not falling for that trick because it lets us move faster than the big companies. Twitch is currently in the middle of spending some horrible millions of numbers of dollars on a team of 20 plus engineers trying and failing to clone a product I built in 3 months.
Wow. That's a really salient example. And when you send the thing that's encumbering them is basically, to be clear, just to underscore it, it's not the features, it is the tooling to do the development that is encumbering them, correct? Basically.
Absolutely. It is the state of how development goes at a company like that, especially the way they have engineered things themselves. They have this giant multi-million file single page app based on Create React app that powers all of Twitch's user experiences right now. They have chaotic infrastructure that is all like DIY rolled. They refuse to use any third-party providers for video stuff, which makes sense for their core infrastructure. But when they're making a pivot from something like RTMP to WebRTC, realizing they don't have the ability to do it, and then move to pure infrastructure halfway through the project, they keep dooming themselves. And on top of all that, they don't really use the things that they're building because most of Twitch's engineers don't stream or use the platform. So all of these things have resulted in them not really being able to compete with us, but the infrastructure absolutely, and the experience as they architected 100%. The requirements that you spin up every single feature as its own Kubernetes cluster effectively, and you write a Terraform config for every new feature, prevents you from moving as fast as startups need to. All of Ping is a single package JSON, and Twitch cannot keep up.
Yeah, that's so people that you gave the before. Like you've got to, if you're going to start work on a new feature, you've got to write a Terraform script or execute one. Like what's the after at Ping to get started with, everything just being a package JSON?
You write the code that does the thing.
And then you're done. Or at least you can start. So
usually you're done that fast too. One of the most mind-blowing moments I had at Ping, one of our best engineers, they were a ramen chef before starting at Ping. They'd been building game engines in Zig for fun and never touched web dev at all. I gave them a side project just to like work and like direct them for a bit. Was super impressed with how quickly they picked up Typescript in the stack, brought them in. They were building a lot of like tech features for our like internal admin tools for like provisioning rooms and managing like the full experience for users when they signed up. They did this for half a year, super successfully, built a bunch of our internal tools, the back end, the front end, the API layer between them and all that. We started speccing out a new project for call recording, for like recording a call to have the assets for after the fact. And this had to be done on a real box with real infra. You can't serverless a recording and a transcode. It's way too heavy and way too long of a runtime. So we built like a whole spec out for it. And at the end, they started asking this question. It said, like, I feel so dumb asking, but what's an endpoint? Up until that point, the concept of an endpoint hadn't mattered. They'd been developing a Ping full stack for 6 months, but because of how we used tools like PRPC and Next.js and Typescript, they were able to write functions and then call them, and everything did what it was supposed to.
They didn't have to worry about the actual marshaling in between the front end on the client to the server. It just kind of bridged everything for them.
They didn't understand beyond some code runs on our computer, some code runs on theirs. That was all they had to understand. They didn't have to think about where the servers were coming from, how the database connected to them, what would happen if somebody hit this super fast a whole bunch in a row, how we make sure the API layer doesn't change when somebody else comes in, making sure they had enough code coverage to actually shift the feature, having a dedicated QA person that has to come in a week later, test it, and not really know what they're testing. Like all of those steps that are inherent to like the way Twitch did things were so irrelevant that the concept of an endpoint was foreign to them. And that stood out to me since.
Yeah, that's that. I think you've mentioned that in a past episode a few months ago, and I definitely remember that. It's such a surprising data point. It speaks a ton to the power of a really great abstraction. You don't have to worry about it. It's all in the mechanics taken care of for you. One other thing, though, that you said caught my attention, which is built a lot of things under Kubernetes, and it should all be Lambda functions. It does really. That's like a statement I hear over and over again. It does feel like Kubernetes was kind of overkill for a lot of problems, got a lot of popularity. It's useful for it's useful, but it definitely pulled people into basically they need more personnel and infrastructure ops in order to execute on it. Would you agree with that or disagree?
Absolutely. Kubernetes is the Flutter of infrastructure. It solves a very specific problem better than anything else, but you probably shouldn't be using it.
I love okay. I've not used Flutter, but I extrapolate. Another, I would call it a big technology not invented here syndrome. I see a lot of actually enterprise companies, less so the small 10 person company, adopting, thinking that, well, to do this in Kubernetes, and then the large ops team to manage it and on the productivity. So that experience definitely resonates. If there's anybody who has a difference of opinion, please raise your hand. Would love to hear.
The other side of this one, because I do think about this a lot too. Like I have a bunch of investors who are heavy infra people, and like my big closest mentors who I still look up to a ton give
Yeah.
me a lot of crap for my takes here.
Okay.
There's a problem where developers will optimize to do things the way that's easiest for them, unaware of how expensive that is for the company. Like we look at the cost of a Lambda function invocation. We're like, oh my God, that's going to cost us $80 a month. If I spin up my own Kubernetes cluster with auto scaling, it'll cost us $40 a month. Not realizing that their time is $300+ an hour, and it's going to take them 2 weeks to set it up, and then a few hours every week from that point forward to make sure it doesn't go down. You'd have to be spending hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on infrastructure through Lambda before it makes sense for that developer to do that. And if you're at that point, you need those developers. If Ping is successful, I'm going to have to hire somebody like Jin, the famous Rust dev from to come rewrite all my terrible TypeScript code in Rust in order to make us like cost effective. But that's not the problem that we have right now. And most companies don't have that problem yet, even really big ones. Infrastructure is cheap. Lambdas are cheap. Edge is even cheaper. You could avoid so many of the like runtime costs that things like Kubernetes save just by not using them and using serverless technologies instead. And that reality has finally started to set in hard, I feel like. I used to get a lot of pushback when I said that. And nowadays I feel like everybody's pretty aligned that if you can make it serverless, you definitely should.
Yeah, you reminded me of, and I agree, that's a great option of kind of the side of the argument. There was a post on Hacker News. I'm actually trying to Google it right now. Something like a single server, and forget about Lambda versus Kubernetes. He's like, how much processing you can do. He does the math on, how many requests per second you can serve with a single bare metal server. And then he goes all the way to compare it against something like Lambda. And he's like, look, the premium is real. There's a cost there. But it goes back to what you talked about. Like, it's more valuable, developer time or your infrastructure costs. And if you're a very large company, then it could be your infrastructure costs. But I remember this article back when, days of Twitter, and people were saying they made a mistake building on Ruby. It's harder to scale. And they at the time had a blog post where he said, say that, but had we used a more scalable solution, we may never have discovered Twitter. We never have pivoted into being as successful as we could have. So it's a good problem to have. I definitely agree that actually in the early stages of a digital experience, the ability to iterate and adapt is really critical. I mean, it was one of the themes of the Composability Summit. It's this idea that when you build things in Lego blocks, you can build and rebuild and adapt as needed. And some of the hard data on this, or soft data, depending on how you look at it, like the McKinsey survey they did, and I think it was something like 9 out of 10 business leaders were saying, we don't believe our business model and our digital experiences will stay the same over the next, 18 months. We're going to have to change fundamentals of our business model, which means you probably have to change fundamentals of your digital experience. So like now more than ever, change is a huge factor. And so you don't want to have to deal with all these, all these things down into something that's harder to modify. So that makes a lot of sense.
Rant a while back on the replaceability of software components or pieces that you build your software from. That was among your answer particularly salient, and so off to you there on that. But that one in particular, you were focusing on front end tech, but it applies up and down the stack of just don't use things you don't need or that solve problems you don't have, and you solve them later.
Double down on what Jason just said, and criticism of your talk on the Composability Summit, Theo, was that you did not do the ship of thesis meme or as a talk topic as much.
Yeah, I know. I that was the talk that I had thought through the most and was most ready to give, and it was close enough. I agree. I could have done a more composability-focused Composability Summit talk, but I didn't have the time to write that talk.
We've got the newsletter. We're going to have additional talks and content. To us, it's a one-time thing. We'll have evergreen. So there's second chance for all of us. So I look forward to that. It's a really important, powerful metaphor. So forward to that road. Just leave this for anybody else who wants to raise their hand if there are any other thoughts on this. There is, last 10 minutes. There was one other thing I put in. Oh, there's actually two other things, but I don't think we have time for everything that I put in the newsletter. Also came up, Theo, that you were talking about might be a good seg, is TypeScript. And you mentioned you had this game design and you ramped up about TypeScript. And so we had a link in the letter on just a quick tutorial on TypeScript for folks. But I guess what's the proposition I want to propose for Fate here is, if you haven't bothered to learn TypeScript, you need to now. It's reached the point, like you're behind the curve for not knowing that. Posted, we also put the link to the Stack Overflow survey showing that, script is more loved than even JavaScript. Is that a proposition folks would agree or disagree with? Straw man to throw out there.
This is the take that I've been preaching forever. I didn't like web development until TypeScript be like web dev. Everyone should. My biggest issue with this take is that TypeScript learning materials are mostly focused on learning what makes TypeScript different from JavaScript and learning TypeScript assuming you already know JavaScript. A thing I've wanted for a long time is a JavaScript tutorial written in TypeScript for new devs. That is, it's TypeScript the whole way through, but it ignores the type part for as long as it can. And then says, by the way, that colon thing that we've been telling you to ignore, this is actually what that does, to teach you JavaScript with error correction and like squiggly underlines and autocomplete, and then get you to TypeScript after.
Wait, so I thought I understand what you were saying, but basically you're proposing you teach people TypeScript without actually showing them how to do it without
you teach a tutorial that is written in TypeScript, but that would make sense to a JavaScript developer, which is something that you could do very seamlessly with Create T3 app, maybe.
So I'm talking like even like newer developer, like somebody who's never coded before. I want them to be able to start with TypeScript. But right now, the learning materials are not at a point where they can. If you are a brand new developer and you want to like stick web dev, you probably need to start with a JavaScript tutorial and then hope you can find a TypeScript tutorial focused on your level of as a JS dev. What I am proposing is something like Free Code Camp, but it's in TypeScript the whole way through. It just doesn't talk about the TypeScript part until like halfway or so through. So you are learning TypeScript as your first language.
You don't even realize you're in TypeScript. That's your starting point.
Yes.
So is that to bring this back to the beginning of the discussion, does that bring us back to your tutorial should start with Dino? If you're going to, beginner course is using Dino because it's TypeScript baked in.
No, it was in a better place and browser compatibility was more consistent, maybe. But I think this should be with like either a pre-baked like browser instance with VS Code and everything, like put in like code sandbox style. I don't think that anyone should have to set up anything on their machine for this like first level tutorial. I was just bringing this up super quick I think TypeScript is, I was trying to agree with Deshaun's take so hard that I think beginner devs should use it too. And was saying the only thing holding us back right now is the quality of education materials for new developers starting with TypeScript. You know what that's?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
No, I'd say the same thing. And actually it would be a good back to basics kind of to go through. Sure. And another thing I thought about too is it's very similar. I mean, just about this, instead of doing vanilla JS, a lot of people started off in React, right? Same kind of thought, right? That you're
That's a great analogy.
The only downside is you can't just pop open your browser's console, start typing TypeScript. So until
that's kind of, there's a proposal that's getting through pretty far that looks like you'll be able to paste TypeScript code into your console and have it run. While losing that sucks, I feel like we've to an extent lost that already. Like any vanilla JavaScript code you look at probably has a require statement in it. You can't copy paste that into your console anyways. I kind of think it's a disingenuous argument for a while.
Yeah,
that's
totally true. Can't run React in the console anyway. So it's like, you need a TypeScript REPL. Like you just need a way to run code arbitrarily. Like there's very simple ways to do that. It doesn't require using dev tools.
To go back to the React example of this is kind of putting with React, I half agree, half like really want to push back on that, because there are a lot of times where I write JavaScript or do web dev where I'm not using React. There are precisely zero where I'm not using TypeScript. It's the replacement for JavaScript. It is what you're going to move to anyways. React is probably how you're going to make UIs. It might die in the near future. You might have a job that doesn't use it. You might go to backend. Who knows? React is great. We all love it. And yes, a lot of people are starting with React, not JavaScript. I think starting with TypeScript, not JavaScript, makes way more sense and is done way less often for no good reason other than the education materials.
I'm going to slight disagree. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. You go ahead. I just got to grab the door now. So you can go first, Ishan.
I was going to slight disagree, but go ahead.
I think you said you had to get the door.
Yeah,
Okay.
I got to take my off. So.
I disagree that everyone's going to write TypeScript all the time forever.
Yeah, I think we're too much in the cutting edge. Give you an example. It's a little bit niche, but there are plenty of sites like that are not using React yet, that are not using TypeScript. They're still vanilla JS. And going back to that typing things in the console.
And Theo hates those sites and thinks they're an abomination.
Well, unfortunately, they're like, well, I don't know, 80%. I have to put the numbers on.
Yeah, I think that the 80% of the jobs that are hiring are not working on those dead sites. Like these metrics are always so fascinating to me because people share these as though that's where 80% of the jobs are. They aren't. The reason these sites are on the old tech is because they're not changing. They're not updating them. They're not like meaningfully improving them. Like of the percent of the web that's on WordPress, 50% of it's hackable as shit. It hasn't been updated for years. That's just the reality of the web. We're too excited about those numbers because they make us feel better about not changing our tech stacks when the jobs are using the better technologies. And if they're not, then the companies that are going to run laps around them.
So I don't disagree with that. But when it comes to understanding the fundamentals of how things work, I think there's a place for understanding vanilla JS, just like there's a value in actually knowing what an endpoint is and how HTTP works. And you can only get so far, and it appears like magic.
I think you can process things when you run into those problems, and you can learn those after the fact. I think that learning TypeScript from the start has that cost. Absolutely. You don't understand the difference between JavaScript and TypeScript as early as you would otherwise, but it comes with the huge, way bigger positive of you now have error checking, autocomplete, and all these other awesome developer experience wins that make it easier to learn in the first place. It is a trade-off, yes, but we're talking a very small cost for a very big gain with a lot of easy ways to pay off that cost. I don't necessarily agree with the same with React because the gain is React is cool and you'll see something in the UI like on your computer faster.
Yeah.
But the cost is you're buying much more into a specific thing. I think that when you compare the cost to benefit here, it's a huge difference between the two.
I'm arguing against the idea that magic, like hesitate when a developer entry point is a point at which it's magic, what happens between them. And I've run into situations where they can't learn it on the fly. Maybe an individual thing, but sorry, somebody else was going to go. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think like what Theo's saying resonates for me a lot, and I've seen it in a couple different arenas. And so I think what you're saying as well, Sean, because it's very hard for new devs to get dropped into a framework where, magic setters or getters or just things happen because that's the way it works. And that can be very jarring, but the trade-off is traditionally that the capabilities those devs get to do, if they're able to disregard the magic and if they're able to be okay with the level of abstraction in their understanding, is they can get a lot further. And so the complexity in education that I think Theo's touching on really well is And I saw this, I would say a good example is in the Ruby and Rails community. You had a bunch of devs come in and want to learn Rails. And there was this very jarring experience where people wouldn't know what was Ruby, what was Rails. They were all learning them both at the same time. Many beginning devs didn't know which was what. Like they didn't know what was the language and the framework. And I think that there's benefits there, but the education around it, like the fact that when you're a junior dev and you hit a wall, you fundamentally in 2022, if you're starting with TypeScript, let's be honest, you're learning JavaScript, you're learning a lot of ECMAScript, and there's a lot of the stuff you're doing day to day is like ES 2016 later. And then you're also learning TypeScript and probably some compiling tool chains and a bunch of tooling on the front end. And there's probably some Babel stuff. So it's a tough field. And I think what Theo's getting at, because I felt this, is when I go to learn TypeScript, there's a huge bisection in the documentation community. And as a new dev, I think it's one of the worst things is not knowing whether to Google the issue you're hitting with the word TypeScript or with the word JavaScript or with the word React. And that can be very unsettling. And that's, I think, the root of what Sean's getting at is that you don't, not knowing which piece is doing what and not having that fundamental understanding. That being said, that's definitely a risk, and that's a problem that needs to be addressed, that the deeper knowledge of vanilla JS fundamentals will always be helpful and will always give a better understanding of what's happening. But for a brand new dev, I can resonate with what Theo's saying because I've just picked up TypeScript more in the last year, and I started with their handbook, and I have a lot about their docs. I hate a lot about their docs, but I got sucked into TypeScript for JavaScript developers, TypeScript for OOP developers, TypeScript for this. And they just start you off with JavaScript.info and MDN too. So they kick you off right at the beginning and say, well, JavaScript first. I think what Theo is getting at is it would be really cool to have a tutorial that's just learn to build like a JavaScript application. And it starts with the same material you would see in beginner JavaScript applications, but it's just using TypeScript the whole way. And it doesn't make a big deal out of TypeScript until the benefits become obvious. So it doesn't do a bunch of talking about type system and how to type objects and generics. Like none of that is presented the way most TypeScript tutorials present it as kind of like class citizens, but hey, here's a beginning to programming that will use JavaScript plus TypeScript plus some stuff along the way. And you get to discover some of those pieces as you go, rather than like comprehensively learn how TypeScript is completely different than JavaScript, which is what a lot of the resources are.
Yeah,
I have to run my show. That was a super good, like, way to compare our takes here. Only thing I want to say is I think that because people learned React and never could tell the difference between React and JavaScript, because people learned Rails and can't tell the difference between Ruby and Rails, that those were like if those were like an 8 or 9 out of 10 concern and problem, learning TypeScript instead of JavaScript's like 2 out of 10. And because those 8 and 9 out of 10 were so bad, we're scared of doing the 2 out of 10 one. I have to run for my show.
Wait,
on Twitch, if you guys are into that, peace y'all.
Yes. Hey, so who's going to create this is my question.
I've got a couple drafts that I'm working on about education.
All right, Nate and Theo hit each other.
Yeah, I look forward to that. I agree with what Theo said. I think you really captured and threaded the needle between both arguments. And I think part of it is my own personal bias. How I learn and the context I get pulled into, or in the last couple of years have been in performance or where those details mattered. But I absolutely actually agree when I sat and reflected on it. It's about what we talked about earlier, developer productivity. And I think if that's the overriding metric, then yeah, it does actually make sense to potentially learn just pure TypeScript first.
Yeah. And I think the gap that we're identifying is very understandable too, because if you look at classical curricula development, like if you look at higher education, computer science programs pretty much always trail the industry significantly enough that you hear every college student saying, wow, I don't learn anything useful in my college class.
Oh yeah.
I was making web apps on, MCAT with Java and like JSP. I knew the second I started that class, I was never going to use any of those technologies again in my life. And I haven't. But that's part of the difficulty of trying to develop and design a repeatable curriculum for technology that evolves yearly. And I think that's why there's a big gap is it's like today, nobody's really solved the problem of how to best educate a web developer entering the industry in 2022. Most people were busy inventing what 2022 is over the last couple of years. And so education is always going to inherently trail. And I've experienced it a lot working with a lot of juniors and mentoring a lot of junior devs. And so recent one I can give is from React stuff, where I was working with the dev through some stuff and he just started typing code and I was like, that's not right. And I was like, well, dude, what are you doing here? Like, what's this syntax? What are you writing? And he says, oh, well, that's a hook syntax. And he's got square brackets on the left side of an assignment. And I'm like, well, that's not a hook. Like, you're calling a hook, but what are you actually doing there? And he's like, I don't know. This is what you do for hooks. And it was simply object destructuring.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, dude, this guy didn't learn S 2016. So for him, the gap in knowledge was like, go to the MDN docs for ECMAScript and go look at object destructuring, go look at nullish coalescing operator, just get the newer JavaScript stuff. So that's where I'm like, even vanilla JS isn't really a good intro these days because it's like, you kind of got to learn JS 2022. And that's super weird and nuanced unless you just go and read a shit ton of modern code where everybody's kind of less. You're like, oh, okay, I see arrow functions now. Okay, I see destructuring. I see spread operator. Like you pick that up, but none of the tutorials do a good way of like, here's your hello world. Now let's go do something with object destructuring. Like so far down the rabbit hole that you get to those fundamentals, when in reality, you'll probably encounter them pretty quickly in real code. And those are things that I think it's really painful to have that like React, what's just ECMAScript. And again, you go to the console and some of these things don't even work. So it's like, well, it's not really your JavaScript, but it's your Babel compiler.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's even more confusing. So you're like, oh, you got a polyfill going on there or something weird.
That's the world I run into. And that's why I argue for understanding for all the basic parts. But when you think about developer productivity, does it really matter if they know whether that comes from Babel or not, if it just makes them more efficient? It's what you talked about before. I think maybe it's an inherent trade-off. Like, do you know if it's Rails or Ruby? Does it really matter? You just know that like you get a ton of productivity out of it. Like I love productivity and I'm not a Ruby on Rails developer at all, but a lot of developers I respect use it and are completely productive in it and massively productive. But they say, look, there's a ton of like quote magic underneath it. And it's hard to wrap your head around getting productive with it at the same time as understanding all that magic that's happening under the hood. You kind of have to just accept certain elements of magic to keep moving forward and cranking something out. But there will be a gap unless you go back.
Yeah. And I think that's a trade-off that varies based on the technology and the community. So in Rails, their whole philosophy was convention over configuration.
Yeah.
So in Rails, because of that philosophy, ignoring the magic was incentivized and it was rewarded. Because ignoring the magic, all you had to do was know how to name your stuff, know where to put the files, know how to do all of that. And they intentionally wanted you to not know any of the magic. So I think in that environment, I was encouraging devs like, you really don't need to know how a view gets rendered. Like it just doesn't matter. You're fine. Just call the render function. And on the flip side, I think my opinion, where I would land on the topic is that comprehensively understanding what's happening and what's going on will always give improvements as a developer. It will always make you do better or have more capacity to figure out weird bugs, to figure out performance issues, to build good software. But it's hardly ever necessary at a base level. And so I guess the way I would frame it is like in the context of video games, think about the skill ceiling and the skill floor. Like I think the skill ceiling or the skill floor should be low where it's like, hey, you get to this point and you can be very productive and effective without understanding any of the magic. And that's great. But once you get to that point and you are being productive, go and read, script the good parts. Go and follow Douglas Crockford. Go find some of those crazy talks. Watch the reactivity talk, the what is reactivity. Like understanding the conceptual foundations will always push you closer to that skill ceiling, and it's incredibly high. And so that's where I think like working in Rails, I had a buddy I worked with who knew the internals of Rails enough to reach in and use them for complex database queries. So you couldn't do certain queries with active model, but you could use the relational algebra library that Rails implemented their active model with, and then you could compose your own complex queries. So when people really get the magic, there is powerful stuff you can do. You can hook into the framework. You can a lot more stuff and arguably be more efficient over a long term. But also, you could have a developer that doesn't know any of that stuff accomplishing the same goals feasibly. One of those things where I think it's like you got to find that skill floor that you think it is, where it's like, okay, have enough of the basics to go on faith, and be effective at what I'm producing. And then beyond that, you should push yourself towards that skill ceiling because you can most likely always become a better developer in many ways by learning the deeper conceptual stuff. But it's just, I think my one issue with Sean with your logic and where you were going is just don't try to do that comprehensive learning before. Like, don't make that your threshold or that your goal, because that's where juniors get tripped up is like, okay, I'm starting to learn TypeScript, right? This TypeScript thing, they sent me to the MDN docs for JavaScript. I'm going to go learn every single thing about JavaScript. And then I'm going to go back to the TypeScript handbook. I'm going to finish everything in the TypeScript handbook. Then I'll start writing code. And that's
And
where I push back more. And it's like, I think you have to give good pauses to like, it's okay for me to go and learn stuff and just deal with the magic for a while.
yeah, no, I'll acquiesce that. Yeah, there has to be some level of abstraction you're going to operate at because you can't think about everything all at once. That's why I said, like, if metric is developer productivity and you're not, as I said, I'm biased. I was very biased from basically the perspective of problems that I've been dealing with, where those details matter. But if you're just cranking out something new and you're at the 0 to 1 stage of building something rather than optimizing it, I think that makes a lot of sense. Like, who cares about the magic? Just get something done. It's a lot of sense. So I go along with that. But really valuable discussion.
I'll
Yeah.
jump in.
Yeah.
As someone who's been writing JavaScript since the beginning of time, I'm recently started to try to figure out TypeScript. I'm late to the party. Matt Peacock on Twitter, if anyone's familiar with him, he's some really good stuff. Hope it's necessarily all that well geared towards beginners because I haven't been a beginner in a very long time. But it was very helpful for me as someone who's gotten pretty far down the JavaScript rabbit hole, understand why and how I should use TypeScript.
Yeah.
That's
So
a-
his tutorial, so that's at github.com/total-TypeScript.
Yep, that's the
And
one.
he's got an org with a couple different, there's a beginner's tutorial in there that's incredibly easy. I think everybody should, like, it should be pretty accessible. And I actually did that on a live stream on Sunday. I actually went through and did some of that, which was pretty fun.
Out again.
Good resource.
Yeah,
Yeah,
let's
it's
do
called
the
that
next week's
TypeScript.
newsletter. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so on GitHub, the org is called Total TypeScript. So it's github.com/total-TypeScript. And
Cool.
he's got an advanced course that's like a workshop format that's a little bit more like I could really work my way through that independently just because it was little, like it's designed for a workshop session that he runs. But then there's a beginner's one that's awesome. And it's got like tests and exercises and solutions and everything. So really fun. I went through that over the weekend.
Did you do a stream of that? Did I hear you correctly, or you just did it on your own?
Yeah. So that's .tv/electrobruin. There should be a VOD in there.
Let's link to that as well. I think that would be great for
Yeah,
for next
Twitch.
week.
I'll dig up the VOD and link it. I'll tweet or something.
Okay, tweet it for sure.
Yeah, the thing I'll just add on this that you remind me of, the way to also thread the needle here is the like, one of the things you need to learn as a dev is learning to learn. Reminded of my colleagues who did volunteer teaching of kids programming. And he said the very first thing we teach them is how to Google, not how to like, it's how to Google. That they can figure out. And he was doing this for, privileged kids in country. And so they didn't necessarily have that background of just like, hey, just expect that you're not going to know all the answers and you're going to have to learn how to find the answer. It's going to be actually the most foundational skill development. And there's not the science fiction book, but Andreessen in an interview has a description of it. I can't remember the name of it, but it's a whole science fiction book about a world where people don't know how to do anything other than Google for things. Find the name of that. But the thing I think that threads this is knowing how to get past what you're calling the skill ceiling. Okay, we are actually past time, but this has been a really great discussion. I appreciate especially when people disagree with me. That's how you learn. Theo, and especially on that last one. At this point, I'll hand it over to Scott to us out.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Don't forget, if you got value from the folks on the stage right now, go ahead and click on their face, follow them, because if you got value from them here, you are definitely going to get value from them elsewhere. So much for everybody that did come up and speak today. Theo, Nate, Jason, Anthony, so many others. I'm sure I missed a couple people, but y'all so much greatly appreciate it. We are here every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So be sure to join us again next week, where we're going to be talking about more awesome stuff. As always, thank you so much. If you haven't gotten our newsletter yet and you want to know what happened the week before and what's going to be happening in the following week, sure to go to composability.dev and subscribe there. And you'll receive our lovely newsletter that we've been putting together. We just did the first week. So really cool stuff. I put things in there like getting to Nate's there and, thing he just did and GitHub deal as well. So learning TypeScript, fun stuff. Anyway, yeah, thank you all so much. Greatly appreciate it. We will see you all next week on Wednesday at 12
Thank you.
p.m. Pacific Standard Time.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. Take it easy.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Man. Appreciate it. All right. I know y'all are waiting for the outro. Okay. Peace.